It's hard to not start off every video about a Final Fantasy sequel game the same way. It's a series where every entry being its own distinct thing was practically hard-coded into its DNA for the first half of its existence. Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest both walked this path together for a good decade and a half, despite the Loto trilogy, i.e. 1, 2, and 3, having some loose connection. But in early 2002, after popular fan reception to the short video titled Eternal Calm included in Final Fantasy X International version, a name I always found weird as hell considering it was a Japanese exclusive, and I know it's meant to be because it takes into account the gameplay differences from the staggered release of the international versions, but still, strange name, make better. Square Enix would break from this path and get to work on Final Fantasy X too. As video games evolved and development costs started to get higher and higher, sequels started to seem like a more tempting option. Why waste time and resources writing a whole new setting, designing new characters, and creating a world to stick them in when you can just asset flip the old stuff? I mean, Final Fantasy X had a budget of about 4 billion yen, and while X-2's isn't publicly available knowledge, the size of the team was a third of its predecessor, so financially, it's just one of those things that probably made a lot of sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Nowadays, it's practically an expectation that a Final Fantasy game will get a sequel or some additional content past its main release. I say practically an expectation because 100% without fail, every mainline Final Fantasy since X has gotten it in some way, shape, or form. But I have to stress, Final Fantasy X-2 was the watershed moment. It was the very first game to defy series tradition and continue off a previous entry. I mean, think about it this way. Final Fantasy X-2 released before a single entry of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII did, and that's basically a series within a series at this point. Final Fantasy X would also attempt a compilation-style thing, but, that's a story for later in this video, you feel me? They didn't even know what to call this sequel at first. The name X-2 was initially rejected for being a what does that even mean kinda name. Does it mean 12? People are gonna think it means 12. Considering the circumstances, FF10-2 had a lot to live up to. Not only was it the first Final Fantasy sequel, it had to be the follow-up to FF10, a game most people would probably agree ended perfectly and was in no way in need of a sequel. So, the big question on everyone's mind is, how did it turn out? How has it forever altered the legacy that 10 left behind? How does X-2's mere existence affect the lens we consume the entire Final Fantasy X series with? Well, let's just say, Final Fantasy X-2 is one of my favorite type of games to talk about. It's complicated, and it can't be summed up with a simple statement one way or the other. We're gonna have to dive in deep for this one, so join me as I do my usual thing with this game. I'll give a spoiler warning before I get into the big stuff, but this game kind of spawned an entire franchise, behind it, and I want to cover that stuff too. Believe you me, I want to talk about that stuff, but I'll give you a heads up beforehand. Anyways, with the preamble out of the way, let's get into this.
It all began when I saw this sphere of you. At least, it looked like you. I couldn't say for sure.
You probably haven't heard of Final Fantasy X Eternal Calm before, which is fair, considering it was a Japanese exclusive piece of side content for like 10 full years. Basically, it's a short in-engine cutscene that shows how our characters are doing after defeating Sin in the first game. Our protagonist, Yuna, has basically become like that one part of Pathfinder Kingmaker where people come to you for advice. But the problem is, she's listless, feels trapped, and misses her days of travel. That all changes when her cousin and previous game party member Riku shows her a sphere featuring a character that looks suspiciously like Tidus. Being spurred into action, she becomes a sphere hunter, a sort of mercenary that tracks down the lost and forgotten spheres in the world to find out more information about, quote, Tidus over here. And I know what you're thinking, I too was like, oh, right, that's where that name comes from. So, she forms the team YRP, also known as Yuripa in Japanese, consisting of her, Riku, and, I'm sorry, who are you? Have we met? 'Cause the game sure likes to act like we have. So this is Paine, a new main character to Final Fantasy X-2, and she's kind of unceremoniously dropped on us in the first 5 minutes, and you're just kind of expected to roll with it. Will we find out her backstory? Yeah, but not for a while. Just long enough for you to think that you missed some Final Fantasy X.5 where they explained it. Anyways, they're part of the sphere hunting group called the Gullwings, which is composed of Riku's brother from FF10, aptly named Brother, Buddy, and Shinra. No relation to the Final Fantasy VII Megacorp. Or maybe relation to the Final Fantasy VII Megacorp? It all depends on what side of the bed series producer Yoshinori Kitase woke up on that day. They have this strange ritual over at Square Enix where they tease this connection between Final Fantasy VII and X every 5 or so years, but don't put much stock into it, is all I'm saying. I like Shinra, by the way. He's this cocky know-it-all child, but the second he's faced with a problem he can't solve, he's like, bro, what do you want from me? I'm like 10.
そうそう。で、どうして？僕まだ子供だし。
Love that little bastard. The gang flies around the world collecting spheres and doing odd jobs for the people of Spira. As for Spira itself, basically, after Sin's defeat, the world finally experienced true peace, but without a common worry to unite them, they did what any bored society does. They started to fight amongst each other. The two factions that arose are New Yevon, the people who follow the teachings of the Yevon faith from the previous game, because I guess when every part of your belief system is proven to be a lie, the best thing to do is double down on it. And the Youth League, a more Spira for the Spirans, share the knowledge of the old world type of faction. Quite literally, the Boomers versus the Zoomers. Tensions are starting to reach a head between the two factions, and while Yuna plans to stay neutral, it's becoming clear that everyone's going to get drawn into their conflict one way or the other. Now, that's the game's overall setting. If you've never played the game, you might be starting to form some images about FF10-2's depiction of Spira in your mind right now. But, with all that said, let me tell you about the game's first few minutes. Just picture everything you know about Final Fantasy X in your mind right now. The world, how it works, the setting, the characters, etc. Okay, got it? Now here's 10-2. I've gotta emphasize, I'm saying this with no exaggeration. This game opens up with Yuna performing at a literal J-pop concert. It's not actually Yuna, but my point stands. Anyone who played this game in 2003, the day it came out, must have had to pick their jaw up off the floor with a forklift. It's just so different from anything that was in Final Fantasy X. It's in these opening minutes where we're introduced to the Gullwing's rivals, the LeBlanc Syndicate, who stole Yuna's dress sphere, a mechanic we'll get into later, and are using it to pose as Yuna. Their leader is LeBlanc, and, those are clothes? Am I going to get demonetized for this, or...? After recovering Yuna's Dancer Sphere, they chase the LeBlanc Syndicate to Mount Gagazet, where they beat them to a Crimson Sphere hidden on the mountain peak. They discover more spheres related to an ancient super weapon called Vegnagun and a mysterious figure known as Shuyin. So, the team sets out to do what they can to try and stop this threat that would challenge Spira's newfound peace and prevent an all-out war between New Yevon and the Youth League. You can get a lot of unique benefits being a sequel that you can't get if you were just another completely different entry like most Final Fantasy games are. Final Fantasy X-2 can leverage a player's knowledge about Final Fantasy X and tap into that to make for a better experience. For example, you get to visit the previous areas and see how they've changed. They're familiar, yet different at the same time. It's really cool to go around Spira and catch up with characters from the previous game. You get to see how time has changed them, what their life is like now, and what their new role in the world is. You get to see how Spira has moved on after the defeat of Sin. You meet Wakka and find out he's gonna be a dad, with Lulu having his kid. You know, I mentioned Wakka being a bit of a massive racist in Final Fantasy X, but I also mentioned his negative character traits give him an opportunity to grow, and I think he found that in X too. I mean, think about it, right? Wakka went from slinging slurs on the back of a shoe puff to killing his own god with a basketball, getting Fire Goth-Top, and settling down as an island chieftain. If that ain't a redemption arc, I don't know what is. There's this one scene where he says thank you to Riku and Albed, and it's just everything coming around full circle. Brother, Riku's illiterate, brother, learns how to speak Spiran so he can talk to Yuna. He's got this whole crush thing going on, and he's gone from being a background character in 10 to this unhinged hype man in 10 too. He's also technically the game's fourth party member if you count the creature system, so there's that as well. Even minor characters from 10 get their chance in the spotlight, and it's cool to run into them across the world. When they ask you if you remember them, you might have a moment where you're like, yeah, I do remember you. 2 years have passed in the game world, and similarly, 2 years passed between the release dates of Final Fantasy X and X-2. Maybe you played them back to back. Maybe you played them on release. Maybe you played 10 20 years ago and just finally got around to 10-2 now. Either way, there's a lot of stuff like this that links the two adventures together. It's nostalgia bait, yeah, but in a good way. You get to visit the spot. You know the one. The camp area that's the defining shot in the original game, and you find out it's been turned into a tourist attraction. You see Kilika, a town that was completely destroyed in the first game, get rebuilt and prosper again. You get to see how the people of Spira have repurposed the Yevon temples. It's also kind of melancholy, revisiting all the places Tidus promised to bring Yuna to. When he originally said it to her in Final Fantasy X, Yuna, at the time, thought Tidus would be coming back here alone, but instead, she's the one coming back without him. But okay, what if you have no context for any of this? Maybe you haven't played Final Fantasy X. I mean, it'd be a bit strange. I assume most people would play this game nowadays through the HD remaster, and I want to know the moon logic behind skipping straight past the button that says start with this one and picking 10-2, but in that case, the game has you covered. There's this little Final Fantasy XIII style data log to catch you up on events of the first game, as well as a few dossiers containing info about some relevant characters. So I want to talk about the gameplay of Final Fantasy X-2. Being the series' literal first direct sequel, you'd assume that the gameplay would be pretty similar to 10. Makes sense, right? Well, I'd encourage you to leave your sense at home, because 10 and 10-2's gameplay are probably as far away from each other as you can be while still being in the genre of turn-based RPG. So much so that it's almost impossible, and probably unfair, to directly compare the two. FF10 introduced this new conditional turn-based battle system. A system with, yeah, sure, a few flaws, but not bad for their first pass at it. Instead of iterating on that battle system, however, 10-2 returns to the ATB system seen in Final Fantasies IV through 9, but I'm gonna be real with you. Final Fantasy X-2's version of the ATB is probably the fastest and most hectic rendition of the system in the entire series. No cap. As usual, you have these bars at the bottom of the screen that fill up as time passes, and when they hit full, you get to use an action. You've got your standard stuff. Basic attacks, magic, items, skills, the works. You've got to be quick though, everything moves at a breakneck pace. Your enemies have invisible ATB bars of their own, and if you don't choose your actions quick, they'll have no qualms with sneaking in 4 attacks while you're scrolling through your items list. About the only similarities it shares with FF10's system is that, while not as strict, the general rule of ranged beats flyers, magic beats elementals, etc. is still in place. That, and a lot of enemy types are reused, which makes sense considering it's the same world and it's an asset flip sequel. But I want numbers. Compared to 10, how fast of a pace are we talking about anyways? Well, it's not the most precise unit of measurement, but I record video clips in 2.5-minute segments. In my Final Fantasy X recordings, if I was just going around fighting, each segment would have 1, maybe 1.5 battles in it. For Final Fantasy X-2, I've got up to 4 crammed in some of these things. The pace is almost incomparable. Your characters will move in and out of position as you act, and it actually does have a slight impact on your strategy with my favorite new addition, the chain system. If 2 of your characters land attacks one after the other, it'll start a combo. The higher you get this combo, the more damage your attacks will do. This adds a really interesting layer of strategy to your moves. You could throw out an attack as soon as your character is ready, but wait 3 seconds and another character's skill will activate and you can chain it with that. Pain can attack now, but she's a melee class and will have to run up to her target. If you wait 2 seconds, you can sync Yuna's ranged attack up with that to cash in on the extra damage. That, and combined with the fast pace of the combat, it leads to, dare I heap this praise upon Final Fantasy X-2, one of the most entertaining turn-based battle systems in the entire series. Not the best one, but it's definitely up there. There's no bigger dopamine hit than using Trigger Happy, one of Yuna's Gunner Dress Sphere skills, to rack up a huge combo, then have Riku and Pain follow up on it. What can I say? Big number good. Now, I said a word there that you might have not picked up on if you've never played Final Fantasy X-2. Dress Sphere. It doesn't sound like a real word, Google Docs is telling me it's not a real word, so what is it? I could explain to you what that is, or I could just tell you the name of Final Fantasy X-2's director. Ah yes, Motomo Toriyama, we meet again. Best known as the director of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. What was this man cooking? Let him in the kitchen and he'll turn it into a change room. It seems that every game he directs heavily features women changing clothes, and Final Fantasy X-2 isn't only no exception to that rule, it's basically the poster child for it. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I mean, I love when games have alternate costumes for their main characters. All I'm saying is, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a pattern, and 4 is just a bit much, nah? So forgetting all that for a second, how do dress spheres work in this game? Well, they're basically a way of switching your class mid-combat. Yuna, Riku, and Pain start off as a gunner, thief, and warrior respectively, but you can change their class by using dress spheres you find throughout your adventure. The first step is to choose a garment grid for your character. This is basically a loadout. You pick a few costumes and slot them into the empty spaces on the grid. You can then change between costumes during battle if they're adjacent to each other on said grid. Each garment grid also has a few innate abilities, and extra ones you can use if you pass by them while switching classes mid-battle, so it's not just their shape you want to pay attention to. There's a layer of strategy to setting up your grids to make sure each character has access to the things they need to do at any given time. If Yuna's your main healer but you have her gunner class 2 steps away on the grid, you're not going to be able to get there in time in the heat of the moment, things like that. Switching classes in battle is easy enough. Just tap the L1 button to open up the grid on any character's turn, and spend an action to have them change into the role you want. Now let me squat down and level with you here. The transformation animations are absolutely lavish. Was 80% of the budget spent on these? Probably. Don't fact check that, just believe it. The team has literally gone on record saying that they took inspiration from 90s magical girl anime when making Final Fantasy X too, and yeah, I can see it. Not only does each outfit have a unique transformation animation when swapping out of it, they also have another for when they hop into a new one. This means that there's 2 unique animations per outfit, multiplied by 3 characters, counting each combination, and the higher-ups probably marched onto the office floor like, you spent 6 billion yen on what? Already we're off to a good start here, since the search for dress spheres incentivizes you to engage in the side content to try and earn new ones. You're obtaining literal full character classes as rewards for some of these things, so it makes sense that you'd want to try and find as many as possible. Hell, just finding one new one could completely alter the way you tackle battles. It gives you a wide variety of options to play with. And that's another point I want to make. Variety, as in variables. You see, Final Fantasy X-2 makes good on a promise the series had flirted with for a few games, but only a few actually commit to. And that's the ability to have any party member fulfill any role in combat. So what do I mean by that? Let's take Final Fantasy X as an example. Even if you threw Yuna down Auron's path in the sphere grid, her base stats will always incline her towards being just a worse Auron. If you forced Auron down Lulu's path, he would just be a worse Lulu, and etc. This is completely different in X-2, where each character's stats change depending on the dress sphere they have equipped. Decided Pain doesn't really seem like the warrior type? Mage it is. Think Riku would be better off with the biggest sword she can hold? Well, Samurai's right there waiting for you. Instead of trying to stick square pegs in round holes, X-2 is built around you making these characters whatever you want them to be, which makes sense since there's only, 3 of them. Sometimes you might need a comp filled with physical attackers, sometimes you want all magic users. X-2's parties are flexible, and you can really go wild here to suit the situation, which you might need to do considering the, frantic pace of the combat. You don't need to level up Yuna as a warrior. If you need a warrior, just switch her to it, and she can do it. This is further emphasized by the way skills work in Final Fantasy X-2. It's pretty simple. Use a dress sphere, earn ability points, those ability points unlock skills for that dress sphere. It also encourages you to use a variety of different types of dress sphere per character. For example, why have Yuna be half-assed at 2 different healer classes when you can go all in on one and switch the other out for a damage dealing role? Plus, since earning AP is as easy as battling, something you're naturally going to do while adventuring anyways, it's kinda just fun and simple to get out there, use some dress spheres, and earn some cool new skills. Limit breaks also make a semi-return in the form of special dress spheres. Once you unlock these, you can use them in battle, which replaces your 3 characters with a lead character and their 2 supports. They're flashy, cool, and a huge power boost, but there's one catch. If you want to make use of them, you have to first swap between every single dress sphere on your garment grid mid-combat. There are garment grids with a smaller amount of dress sphere slots so you can whip them out quickly, but most of the time, you'll have to have one character wasting all their turns aggressively changing clothes if you want to make use of them. The main issue with this is that, unlike limit breaks in the rest of the games in the series, this isn't something you're rewarded with by naturally participating in combat. It's something you have to intentionally do, and it takes away from your overall strategy to do it. I'm sure there's a good way to utilize them, but I only pulled them out a handful of times, and half of those were just so I could grab footage. No cap though, the transformation sequences and skill sets for the special dress spheres are pretty cool. Overall, the dress sphere system does have some other weird downsides though. Obviously, since you're constantly switching between dress spheres, your equipment has to be fluid. There's no one-size-fits-all weapon that works for all of these. Which is why this game probably has the most basic and, honestly, most lacking equipment mechanics in the entire series. Remember in my last video where I commented how weird 10's equipment system was? Well, 10-2 has, practically nothing. Equipment is basically your secondary way of altering your stats in an RPG, the primary way being leveling up. The equipment you choose matters in these types of games. Do you forego stat increases for certain skills or synergy, etc.? Equipment also has an impact on the way you spend your resources, your money. But Final Fantasy X-2 plays it a little different. You see, the only equipment you can put on your characters in this game are 2 accessories each. Yeah, they all have secondary effects that can play into your strategies a bit, but it's 2 pieces of equipment per character. I don't know, it just feels kinda lacking. It's not the end of the world, but I kinda wish there was a slot for armor, or something at least. Now, hang on a sec, something's got me thinking. Let's see, fast-paced combat factoring in positioning, an emphasis on class changing and role switching mid-battle, directed by Motomu Toriyama. Is this just Final Fantasy XIII combat, but you control all of the party members and instead of each character having 3 bars, they just have 1? The more I played, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that, yeah, it basically is. It's a stretch to say it's the exact same, but I could feel the DNA of Final Fantasy XIII as I was playing. And it double makes sense because the game the Final Fantasy X-2 team would begin development on after finishing X-2 was 13. Other teams would handle the development of 11 and 12. You can really trace the evolution of how they wanted to take the turn-based RPG system throughout these games. Now, I'm gonna keep it 100 with all of you. I think X-2's battle system is better than 13's, but it just goes to show how significantly a few tweaks can affect basically everything about how a game plays. You might notice though that X-2 only has 3 main party members, making it the game with the lowest number of party members in series history. Now, this has its downsides. A large cast increases the chance the game will have more characters a particular player likes. There's more variety and more opportunities for different types of interactions. But of course, having more characters introduces its own problems. A lot of games do this thing where the party members will interact and have relations with the main character, but barely talk to each other. I'm not saying the Final Fantasy games have this issue, some do, some don't, but for every party member you add, you're essentially adding another notch on a web of relationships. By only having 3 party members, X-2's cast can play off each other really well. Yuna, Riku, and Pain's personalities mesh and bounce off of each other, and you get occasional added spice when side characters like Brother or LeBlanc are thrown into the mix. I think it's a really fun dynamic, and I can find a bunch of cutscenes to support that. To shake up the gameplay variety, like its predecessor, Final Fantasy X-2 is packed full with little minigame distractions you can participate in. I said in the last video that these were a perceived way of adding value to a game back in the 2000s. Having lots of little side minigames was thought to be a big plus, especially since it was an era where attach rates, i.e. the number of games people owned for their console, was relatively lower than it is now. I finally pinned down a quote that proves the point I was trying to make. Motomu Toriyama stated that one of the goals during X-2's development was to provide a large variety of minigames. The exact phrase was, they wanted to make it so that, quote, if you bought Final Fantasy X-2, you wouldn't need any other game. I'm not so sure about that one. The little gun minigame where you shoot the cactuar isn't that compelling. I'm finna keep it real with you, Mr. Toriyama. I am not solely playing Final Fantasy X-2 until the day I hop in a coffin. Overall, yeah, the minigames are fine, there's a lot of variety, there's even a rhythm game in here, they mix up the pace, and nothing's quite as egregious as the Cloister of Trials from the last game. Except maybe the piano puzzle in the final dungeon, but at least you only do that once instead of like 6 times. In a row. I haven't forgotten. I still hate this room. It's the worst room in all of Final Fantasy X. Blitzball makes a return, and it's been turned into sort of a management minigame. You have almost no involvement in the games themselves. And it turns out, removing almost all player control actually makes for a better version of Blitzball. Now, while I say better, that doesn't mean it's good. Still giving this one a hard miss. I don't know, if you like Football Manager, maybe it's your thing. But enough about the gameplay, I want to go into the visuals. Now, you all already know how I feel about this HD remaster. The faces in Final Fantasy X are boring and flat when compared to the original, and it really takes away from the impact of a few scenes. Does it ruin the game and make it not worth playing? No, but it's a blemish on what should otherwise be a well-made package. This all went down because Square lost the original files for Final Fantasy X and outsourced the majority of the remake's work to a third-party Chinese studio. It's just a shame that it ended up like this. There's no quote-unquote perfect version of these games because of it. You either get the good faces but the unupdated spirit grid and 4x3 size of the original, or have to wonder what facial expression Yuna should be making in this scene if you play the HD version. This is all to say, it's a shame that... wait, hang on, that looked really good. What the hell? That was face animation Sakuga. And, wait, you can skip cutscenes now? You couldn't even do that in Final Fantasy X HD. What is going on here? So yeah, while the files for Final Fantasy X were sitting in the dumpster alongside that katana the former Nintendo CEO used to wave around the office, X-2's files were preserved, meaning you get to see them how they were always meant to be seen, only in HD. And, yeah, these character models are pretty damn incredible. If you've played the Kingdom Hearts PS2 games, the way these faces animate is probably more than familiar to you. Like those games, there are two versions of each character's face, one for when they're in the background, and one for when they're front and center of a cutscene. Final Fantasy X HD did this too, but unlike in that game where you have to squint and be like, is that the good face? No, it's not, false alarm. Trust me, you'll know when they make the switch in X2 HD. This isn't even an HD version versus HD version kind of thing. You can see how much better their animation work got in the 2 years between X and X2. This is all in-game rendering as well. I've seen mid-gen PS3 games that don't even look and animate their characters this good. It really brings this world to life, and I appreciate the effort that went into it. The improvements in quality of life features X2 has over X make it seem like these are two different games that just ended up in the same HD collection. It's another knock against this remaster for me personally. Things like the ability to skip cutscenes should have been made consistent across both games. It's almost like baffling to me. Yeah, the original X2 for PS2 had the feature to skip cutscenes while X didn't, but that's what remasters are for. Updating the original version to have the quality of life features that would be implemented later. I don't know, it just feels like the simplest thing in the world. They couldn't have been that short on time. Even if the faces in X were a lost cause, a few more months in the oven could have improved the overall package so much. I guess it just do be that way sometimes. Oh, and if you're wondering if X2 has the same crashing issues I was getting with X, the answer is sort of. The game would sometimes crash when I alt-tabbed, something I have to do often to take notes, but since it was exclusively when I alt-tabbed, I guess I can sort of say it's my fault? It at least beats the hell out of it crashing after a 15-minute long multi-phase late-game boss encounter. As for the rest of the visuals, there's not much to go over that hasn't already been said in my last video. The world looks really great. The updated textures and resolution really brings this game from 2003 into sort of the modern age. It makes sense that all this would be pretty much the same for Final Fantasy X too, because it largely reuses the same assets from X. The areas from X still look great, they're still colorful, and they still give you a real sense of the world and how it's constructed. The enemy models for the most part look great too, but there is one thing that stood out to me. It feels kind of cheap the way some bosses from X are reused as regular fights in X too. Regular enemy reuse? Sure, but considering how difficult bosses in X were and how much of an achievement it was coming up with a strategy to beat them, seeing them just hanging around in X2 kinda dulls the impact. There's also been some improvement in the cutscene direction for X too. A lot of people criticize the cutscenes in X for having like, what I'm gonna call, entry-level Premiere Pro editing, making use of a lot of crossfades and transitions. You can tell there's been a step up in the cutscenes for X too. The camera work is a lot more dynamic. It's a lot better in terms of showing you the action, and the cutscenes feel more alive and energetic. While Final Fantasy X would have sharp camera pans that dart around, X2 is a lot more fluid and shows off what the team learned between the two games. There is one new camera trick they love doing though, and it's one where the camera tracks the lead character's head. I'm not sure why, but this shows up a few more times than it probably should, and it's a bit jarring. But there is one part of X2's visual presentation where it's extremely obvious that this was a relatively lower budget game made to make bank out of pre-made assets. You see, the Final Fantasy series since 7 has always been about showing off lavish, cutting-edge 3D CG cutscenes. This is a known fact, and Final Fantasy X, being on PS2, was really able to push this to the next level. Like seriously, if you watched these cutscenes in 2001, it must have blown your dome wide open. It was done so well that it's almost enough to convince you that the spirits within might be a good idea. The thing about X2 though is that there's a distinct lack of these 3D CG cutscenes compared to the games before it. If this quick search on YouTube is to be believed, Final Fantasy X has about 40 minutes of CG cutscenes, while X-2 has just under half that at 23 minutes. Again, not a major knock against the game, but it's one of those things where you see it and you can immediately start putting pieces together in your head. As for the sound, Final Fantasy X's OST was a banger. Not my favorite overall, but it has a lot of standout tracks I like. Besaid, Thunder Plains, Seymour's boss theme, it's an OST that goes hard. Overall, I'd say for me, it's an OST that hits like a heart rate monitor. It's not that there's tracks I don't like, the quality's pretty good throughout the board, it's just that there's tracks that hit with me and ones that don't. Final Fantasy X-2 is kinda like that heart rate thing, but pumped up to its maximum. There are some tracks that really hit, but then there are some that really don't. The vocal tracks, Real Emotion, the song from the opening, and 1000 Words, I'm gonna be real, I do not care for them. They both pale in comparison to X's vocal track. But X-2's main theme, Eternity Memory of Light Waves, it has no right going as hard as it does. I really like this track. There's this one cover by Moonbow Music that adds lyrics I used to listen to on the daily back like 11 years ago. Make it stop, make it stop, make it stop, make it stop. Anyways, go give that a listen if you've got a spare 3 minutes or so. After you finish watching this video, of course. I like the battle theme and the way it opens up. It definitely fits the faster pace of the fights. Another track that makes the chemical receptors in my brain hit me with the feel-good juice is the new Besaid theme. Besaid Island needs to go down in history as an area in an RPG that has the most consistently good music over multiple games. X-2's rendition is certainly different from the 10 version, but you can just kind of sit there, close your eyes, and listen to it. It's just so peaceful, man. Also, again, I don't know if this is one of those things where you just had to be there, but doesn't this song kinda sound early 2000s as hell? Just me? Nah. And that's another cool part about Final Fantasy X too. Since it mostly uses the same locations as Final Fantasy X, you can hear basically an alternate take on the OST for each area. Like I said, we're in heart rate monitor territory here. There are some songs I could personally give a miss, but there's also a lot that are going on my gym playlist. There's this one track called I'll Give You Something Hot, and, is that just Persona 5 music circa 2003? We're completely out of Nobuo Uematsu territory by this point. This OST was composed by Noriko Matsueda, the front mission composer, whose last OST would sadly be Final Fantasy X-2. It was co-composed by Takahito Eguchi, who would hop ship for Sega right after. He'd actually go on to be the composer for Sonic Frontiers, or at least, one of the 7 composers for Sonic Frontiers. That's the most I've ever seen on a non-collab, non-crossover game, I think. Voice acting stays mostly at a consistent quality with Final Fantasy X. Everyone reprises their roles, and while there wasn't much improvement, Final Fantasy X already set a pretty high bar, so there didn't really need to be. Even the HD remaster of 10 and 10-2 came about before dual audio options were completely widespread, so I had to do a little finagling to play in Japanese, but it was nice to see the other side of the coin for this playthrough. Do I think the Japanese performances are overall a little bit better? I mean, yeah, but that's not to say the English ones aren't good as well. As is usually the case, and especially was the case in the early 2000s, the original language the game was made in is where the focus is put for the voice track. People often take a hard-cut stance on subs versus dubs, but my rule is simple. I'd rather play the game in the language that the focus was put on, because that's generally where the most budget and attention was given. Now, this isn't just play Japanese game in Japanese, play English game in English. For example, Devil May Cry is in English even in the Japanese version, so even if there was a Japanese dub available, I'd still play in English. Resident Evil games, Metal Gear games, I'll play those in English every time. And on the other side, there's no way I'd play Ghost of Tsushima, a game developed in Washington, United States, in English. I mean, fellas, they hired Akio Otsuka. Like, you know, Snake. As if that's not getting played in Japanese.
耐えてやる。坂井家でも古今無類の武者へとな。
But yeah, the overall quality of Final Fantasy X-2's English dub and localization is good, but there's one part that burned a hole on the inside of my brain, and I have to share it. So right, in this early game mission, you go to Zanarkand where you find out there's a two-part clue to a riddle. In Japanese, the clues are sa and ru. Saru. It means monkey. You got it? Okay. In English, the clues you're given are mon and ki, so monkey. Okay, everything makes sense so far? Monkey, saru, same word, same meaning, no problems here, right? So then you're hit with a question, and you have to decide which of the words is the password. And look, one of the options is monkey. There it is, that's the right one, right? Except that's wrong, you idiot. It's actually a three-part password. The actual answer is Isaru, which is the name of a character. This makes sense in Japanese. Isadu. The saru bit is meant to throw you off, but still be close enough to his name where you can put two and two together. But, the clues you gave me in English were mun and ki, so how exactly was I supposed to do that if I played in English with the English dub? You could infer it by knowing the character's voice, I guess, but that would require you to actively ignore the specific clues you were given. Riku even comments in English, oh yeah, the password and Isaru's name sound similar.
おイサル、イサル。
No, they don't. What? Riku, you good? Monkey, Isaru. Monkey, Isaru. Yeah, sounds similar to me. Yeah, they do sound similar in Japanese, but why keep this line in the English version as well? Was this just like, not localized? They changed Saru to monkey, yeah, but then just left the back half of this plotline completely translated one-to-one. Like, monkey ends up having nothing to do with anything. Yeah, I don't know what was going on with this. Anyways, now that I've hit my unhinged localization rant quota for this video, I want to talk about one major point of contention for Final Fantasy X-2, the structure and pacing. So, I'm gonna take the quick liberty to assume that you've played an RPG before. Whether it's a classic RPG, a linear one, a Western RPG, or anything else really, the vast majority are structured like this. You go from area to area, progressing the plot forward, fighting bosses, watching cutscenes, etc. Actually, now that I think about it, that's most video games, not just RPGs, but whatever. Final Fantasy X-2 is not like this. In fact, it's nothing at all like this, so let me explain. X-2 was made on a tight budget using the vast majority of X's assets. I said it before, but almost every single one of X's areas is repurposed for X-2. While X-2 does have new areas, I'd say like 80% or so of the total are just the same area from 10. If X-2 introduces a new area, it's usually a short dungeon or something stapled onto an old one. So, what do you do here? What's your best option? 10 was an extremely linear game that focused on its journey aspect. Its world is essentially a straight line of connected areas leading to a destination. How do you get a player to go through that a second time that isn't just funneling them down the same path? X-2 handles this issue by kind of being like a reverse Final Fantasy game. You get access to the airship minute 1, and the game is structured into short missions taking place in the Final Fantasy X areas. The only thing that stops you from just going everywhere from the get-go is the fact that the monsters there will probably be way above your level, as indicated by the star rating for each area. You can already probably imagine a few issues with this. Going through all the same areas again isn't exactly the most exciting feeling in the world. Sure, there's a novelty to seeing how each area has changed over the 2 years and hearing a new track for the music, but...
Because we've been here before. We're going in circles.
This is also compounded by the fact that Final Fantasy X-2 is a short RPG. Really short. It takes maybe half the time to beat of its predecessor. While the game tries to make use of each of the areas from 10, there are some places you just never need to go to, barring side content. The game is structured into 5 main chapters, which are then subdivided into missions. You get told which areas the missions are in, and can usually go through them in any order, in the event that there are multiple given to you at the same time. This structure makes the world seem a lot smaller than 10, despite being the same world. A lot of areas are just there to be there. When you can go everywhere from minute 1 from a menu screen, it feels less like you're playing in an interconnected world, and more like you're headed to offshoot areas. Sure, the Mihen High Road connects Luca to the Moonflow just like it did in 10, but why would you walk it when you can head to the save point, teleport back to the ship, and be there in an instant? It gives you this world, but unlike 10, it gives you no reason to go through it. It gives you a shortcut. It's the equivalent of being able to fast travel anywhere in a Bethesda RPG from minute 1. It is cool how the ship functions as a little home base, complete with a Hypello that's confirmed to receive Fire Dome, but there's a reason why you aren't given access to an entire world right at the start for most games. The game tries to spice up the old areas by introducing a new feature to the series, platforming, but you can tell this was their first crack at it, because it's pretty dead simple and doesn't always work the best in some areas. If you approach a ledge, hold circle. If you can jump, you jump. If you can't, nothing happens. That's about as far as the mechanics go. It's just not enough to breathe new life into what feels like a less connected, less, quote, real version of Spira. Another way this pacing problem manifests itself is in the enemy encounter design. Since the main quest has you going to certain areas multiple times for the short missions, they repopulate the areas in between chapters with new enemies that'll appropriately challenge you. But they kind of do this to the detriment of the area itself. It all feels really haphazard. I'll tell you what I mean. Here, in Kilika, why am I fighting the Xanarkin zombie soldiers that only appeared as Farplane ghosts in 10? First of all, lore-wise, they shouldn't exist, since Unalesca is gone, and even if they did, Xanarkin is like, on the polar opposite side of the world from Kilika. How did they cross Mount Gagazet? Because of this structure, the pacing of Final Fantasy X-2 kind of feels like a mess. If I had to put it to words, it feels like you play through the first 30%, then the last 20% of a regular RPG. It feels like there's no middle, no real escalation. You just do things, and then things happen. The game goes from almost feeling like a directionless chain of strung together missions to all of a sudden having world-ending stakes. Like, the Chapter 2 finale involves a minigame where you disguise yourself as an enemy troop and give a massage to LeBlanc. In case you're wondering, yes, the massage minigame is mandatory. I don't make the rules, I don't make the game, take it up with Toriyama. I'm just as confused as you are. Yes, Final Fantasy X-2 is a short game, yes, many of the areas go sad and unused into a corner, but that's if you only do the main story quests. Yeah, of course, like any Final Fantasy game, X-2 has some side content, but it might be more accurate to say most of X-2 is side content, and that's not an exaggeration. Obviously, if you just rush the main story, you'll probably be underleveled, so the side content is a good way to get some EXP grinding in that doesn't involve running in circles around the most optimal farming area. The side content is hit and miss. Some quests involve you desperately scratching every corner of an area, while some manage to tell an okay short story or have a mildly enjoyable objective. Chasing a Waka down? I'm not mad at it. A lot of the finer details of the plot are actually given to you in the side content. The amount of information you have about the game's events is vastly different depending on whether you did some of the more major side content or not. Entire character backstories are relegated to the side content, so you're pretty heavily encouraged to at least do some of it and not just speedrun the main story. There's also a pretty cool Infinite-style dungeon called the Via Infinito, where you battle through 100 floors, and it's enjoyable for what it is. I also think it's kinda hilarious how the super boss of the game is Angra Mainyu, the chief deity in Zoroastrianism, and how the Google results have been completely taken over by some fake character. And then, while not a part of the main game's side content itself, there's also Last Mission, a sort of post-game bonus that was included in the international version. You can think of it kinda like Final Fantasy X-2's Persona 3 The Answer. It's really unique. It's a roguelike that kinda reminds me of the Mystery Dungeon games. Everything works on this board game layout. But, even though I think it's cool and that its inclusion is a good thing, I gotta be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of it. It just way overstays its welcome, and the plot points it touches on aren't the greatest. It takes place a few months after the events of the main game, and the weirdest part is that it continues off a non-canon ending. I could say that implies the ending everyone treats as canon is the non-canon ending, but the other Final Fantasy X Extended Universe stuff continues off the ending that Last Mission doesn't continue from. Yeah, it's confusing, it's kind of a mess, it is what it is. Final Fantasy X-2 keeps track of your side content completion rate via a percentage that's displayed next to your save file. You can even get a bonus cutscene in the ending if you hit 100%. And if you've ever played X-2 before, you know where this is going. You know just what I'm about to say. If you've ever had the passing thought of, I really enjoy Final Fantasy X-2, perhaps I will try to 100% it. Don't. Just don't. Just take that thought, roll it up into a ball, and toss it away. First of all, unless you plan to strictly follow a guide for every second of your playthrough, don't even bother. There's so many frequent permanently missable objectives, and I'm not just talking about a quest only being available at a certain point in the game. There are dozens of extremely specific right time, right place events. To do it naturally, you'd have to completely comb each area after even the most insignificant of plot events. And since objectives only give you about 0.2 completion percent, you can't even be sure exactly what it was that gave you the points. The percentage tracker only counts by integers. And that's a massive pain, but that isn't even the half of it. There are hundreds of conversations that require a specific dialogue choice to be selected. Someone out there had to have done everything to the letter, only to realize they fumbled a dialogue option in Chapter 1. But that isn't even the half of it. Even people who follow a guide step by step to the exact specification of every syllable have reported that they hit the end of the game and didn't get the 100%. And the worst part is, you'll never know what it was that disqualified you. Did you only press X 3 times during this sequence? Out. Did you dig twice in this area? Also out. Did you go to the bathroom during a cutscene? Shit, that probably knocks you down a percent or two. Yeah, seriously, you can't even make use of the skip cutscene feature because that'll rob you of a percent. I don't know if that's true, but that's what people say, and there's no real way of knowing. I have never seen a 100% this bad, this specific, and this meticulous. I have never seen a message online that says, I'm glad I went for Final Fantasy X-2's 100%. Seriously, if you look it up, it's just a bunch of people suffering together. Reading through these guides and the requirements for each task is like interpreting the Dead Sea Scrolls. Even just figuring out how to get the good ending is a task in itself. You might think, no it's not, Google how to get Final Fantasy X-2's good ending. Simple. But you'll have to really dig deep for a straight answer. Does percent have anything to do with it? Maybe. Do you have to do certain things in certain areas, or just this one specific thing? Great question. The best part is, and by that I mean the worst part is, it's almost universally agreed upon that the bonus scene you get for 100% completion actually detracts from the quality of the ending. Your reward is to get further clarification on something you didn't want or need clarified. Thanks, I guess. I don't know what they were thinking with making the completion requirements this insane, but it is rough. Hey, you know that guy on YouTube that does a thing where he completes games to 100%? The completionist? Yeah, let me know if he ever makes one on Final Fantasy X-2. Pacing aside, the tone of Final Fantasy X-2 is wildly different from the last game. 10 had almost a bitter, melancholic tone, what with Spira being a world where lives could just end in an instant. Not to mention each of the two lead characters had to trade between confronting the fact that they are 100% going to die by the story's conclusion. Now, obviously X-2 is going to have a much lighter tone. Spira's at peace, it's the eternal calm. Yuna's adventure starts out with her living her days as a carefree sphere hunter, maybe casually searching for clues on whether or not the person she saw in the sphere was Tidus every now and again. To expect X-2 to have the same tone as 10 would be ridiculous, and it's not the point I'm trying to make. And to be clear, I'm also not ragging on the game for only having female protagonists or anything. I like the main cast. I think Yuna, Riku, and Pain are all great characters. I like the magical girl anime and manga influence they referenced while making this game. No, what I'm referring to is the 30% early game, 20% endgame issue I was talking about before. The tone is altogether way too light for the first 10 or so hours, almost to a weird degree. The Gullwing's main nemesis, the LeBlanc Syndicate, the worst thing they do can be summed up as, "Tee-hee, we played a little prank on you, Gullwings."
ムカつき。その言い方やめなよ。
Then 10 seconds later, they're friends, because Nuji Wooji has gone missing wissing and we gotta findy-windy him. Then all of a sudden it slaps you across the face and just expects you to adjust with it. In the next chapter, you find a planet-destroying machine-y weenie and, oh wait, we've got stakes now. But that's all small potatoes. By far the biggest issue I, and I'm sure many others have with Final Fantasy X-2's pacing and story has to do with the permanent direction it shifted the entire Final Fantasy X universe in. The issue isn't the individual story itself, but instead how it, and especially the media that came after it, would open up a Pandora's box of troubles where there didn't need to be any. And to talk about that, I'm gonna have to spoil the Final Fantasy X audio drama and book, and some of X-2. If you haven't read them, I highly recommend not giving a shit about this spoiler warning, because they're hot trash, but just in case, skip to here if you don't want to know. Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy game to receive a sequel. After that, Final Fantasy VII would basically become its own series unto itself, and there were attempts to have 10 follow in the same direction. But here's the problem. Final Fantasy X arguably ended in the perfect way. It bookended its plot with a strong, hard-hitting conclusion that left you with genuine emotion. Tidus disappearing at the end, after inspiring Yuna to live, after basically changing the lives of a bunch of people in a world he wasn't even from, that hit. That was powerful, and it's moments like that that explain why the story of Final Fantasy X resonated so hard with so many people. It's the legacy that the game would leave behind, the one that would stay intact and untouched for 2 years. Let's be clear about something here. I'm not someone that feels the need to protect the purity of a game's story or legacy. Dirge of Cerberus is dumb, but I'm not mad at it. I actually think it's sorta good in a shitpost kind of way. The story of Final Fantasy VII is still right there, unchanged. Now, taking everything I've said in this video, I like Final Fantasy X too. It's got problems, but I think it's a solid shorter RPG that has a lot of good stuff going for it. I take no issue with it as a game, and I even think the story is pretty good, for the most part. The problem here, and really the problem with the entire Final Fantasy X extended universe, is that it seems to be hell-bent on going back and robbing previous events of their emotional weight. Tidus' sacrifice from 10 is undermined when they decide it's okay to bring him back, and not just bring him back, but literally just bring him back. Like, he's just there. He's fine, he's good. He walked it off.
You're back.
I am back.
The plot of Final Fantasy X-2 isn't about bringing Tidus back. In fact, it's pretty much about the opposite. Yuna's life revolved around missing Tidus for the 2 years since he'd been gone. And Final Fantasy X-2 was, until its last 5 minutes, a game about letting go. Yuna's final line to Tidus in 10, whether that be arigato or I love you, cemented that moment as one of the game's best. At the end of Final Fantasy X, Yuna saved everyone, but there was one person she couldn't save, and the game is mostly about that. Yuna's chasing this ghost of Tidus around Spira because she saw someone that kinda looked like him in a sphere, and this was, and should have been, a story about her coming to terms with the fact he truly is gone. The one person she wanted to save the most was the one person she couldn't save, and she has to live with that. Multiple, and I mean multiple cutscenes make explicit reference to this, as if this is where the story was going. Yuna has a legit-ass character moment when she speaks to Nuge about how she's tired of sacrificing people under the guise of not having a choice. Yuna speaking to Shuyin in this scene is her getting a chance to express the last words she wishes she could have said to Tidus. In case you're wondering, yes, thank you is once again changed to I love you here, so I guess props to them for committing to the bit.
悲しい結末だったとしても笑って言えたかもしれない。ありがとうって。
Just like Shuyin's entire arc, Yuna has to come to terms with the fact that the person who meant the most to her is gone, and while it's terrifying to confront, it's liberating in a sense. The finality of learning the answer to the question as to whether or not Tidus is really gone is heartbreaking. But at least now, she finally has an answer. She can truly move on and live for herself for the first time in 2 years. But then, in the last 5 minutes, the game just decides to go, hey, forget about all that. You want to see him again or not? And then he just washes up on Besaid. How? I don't know, the Faith made him into a Farplane ghost or something. Don't worry about it. And while I'm not a fan of this and say it's a not great conclusion, this isn't even close to where the story ends. Final Fantasy X-3 is a rumor that's been brewing for almost a decade, and we're seeing a resurgence of it in the past year or so. I am, for lack of a better word, scared of a potential X-3, because the way the book and audio drama leave this story is... well, let me explain first. You've probably heard ghastly whispers about the Japanese exclusive novel Final Fantasy X 2.5 Eian no Daisho. It's written by Kazushige Nojima, the writer for 10 and 10-2 himself, so it's not some obscure side thing written by a third party. This is official material. The book is a Japanese exclusive for a good reason. To be blunt, it was so dog water they didn't bother releasing it anywhere else, and have spent the last decade trying to pretend it doesn't exist. If you scroll down to the bottom of its wiki page, under reception, there's a single sentence that states, "The novella has been received negatively by many Japanese fans." Yeah, that's a bit of an understatement. It mostly reads like low-grade fanfiction, but once again, my biggest issue with it is the way it takes the setups and moments from the games and stomps on them for... well, I'm not really sure why. I made it clear I thought unceremoniously bringing back Tidus in the literal last few minutes of 10-2 was a decision that robbed his sacrifice in 10 of a lot of impact. Well, you know what would be even worse? If they killed him again with even less care for building up to it? I know what you're thinking. Surely they wouldn't do that. Surely even a layman could tell that's just bad writing. I wish I wasn't about to read this sentence I typed out last week, but in the novel, Tidus is killed. And the way it happens is he sees a blitzball and kicks it, but it wasn't a blitzball, oh no, it was a bomb. And then he explodes into goo while Yuna passes out from shock. I have no real words for this. There's no joke, there's no funny, no puns, I just want to understand. And we're not even close to done here, because 5 minutes later, they just bring him back. They just bring him back again. Is anyone at home keeping a tally? If you count his initial appearance in Spira, Tidus has died 3 times and been resurrected 3 times. Give the boy a break, he's getting up there with Goku at this point. Why did they even have to include this plot point? Why did he have to kick the blitzball and die? If they're just gonna resurrect him 2 seconds later, they could have cut this out entirely, the conclusion is the same. Why did any of this have to happen? I'm not asking you, I know you're just as lost as I am, I just can't will myself to understand what was going through their heads when they wrote this. The plot summary does include the line, Tidus recalls the power Kush had given him and dashes off, so there is that. Go get him, Tidus. Never mind how insanely out of character both Tidus and Yuna are depicted as in this novel, it's just so poor overall. Killing off and resurrecting Tidus is now treated with less emotional weight than walking into a shop and buying a potion. The novel just fleshes out plot elements that didn't need to be fleshed out. It introduces half a dozen who cares original characters that do nothing but exposit Looney Tunes nonsense. It just overall leaves a bad taste in your mouth after you read it. And while the next piece of our Final Fantasy X extended universe fiction isn't as outright egregiously bad as Eian no Daisho, the audio drama, Final Fantasy X Will, shares a lot of the same problems with what it does to the characters and world. Unlike the book, they're strangely proud of this one. It's front and center on 10HD's title screen. And 10's producer, Yoshinori Kitase, has gone on record saying that Will's plot events are the ones that'll kick off a 10-3 if it ever actually happens. First of all, Will's main problem is that it just deletes any character growth both Yuna and Tidus experienced in 10 and 10-2. Yuna is back to being a people-pleasing puppet, and Tidus is just off doing his own thing or something. Hey, remember how Yuna spent all of 10-2 chasing a ghost of Tidus? How much she wanted to see him again? Remember how Tidus spent all of 10 trying to find a way to save Yuna and didn't hesitate for a second even when the solution was him dying instead? Remember how important these two are to each other? How even if Tidus' second of 3 resurrections was unceremonious, you could at least be glad they got their happy ending? Well, in Will, apparently they just couldn't give 2 shits about each other, which is, again, wildly out of character. And then, out of nowhere, Sin is back. Sin comes back. That's it. There's no explanation other than, damn, someone must have wanted Sin back. It's just there. What was the point of anything if it could just, pop back into existence whenever it felt like it? Who or what even is Sin now? Since the Faith are gone, there's nothing for Yu Yevon to take over. What did all of Final Fantasy X even mean if everything the characters worked for, all the moments of happiness and pain you, the player, shared with them, can just be negated in a single sentence from an audiobook? The whole point of the first game, the whole point of the entire journey, the whole point of the sacrifice was to have Sin not come back. And then it just does, and now that it's here, it makes you question what any of it was for, and that's not a great feeling to have. It actively goes into your brain and takes away some of the experience you had with Final Fantasy X in the first place. And you know what the first thing Yuna does after Sin returns is? Take a quick guess. She marches up to Tidus, tells him she's found a new man and doesn't need him anymore, and they break up. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be feeling right now. Empty, mostly. At least the new character art for Tidus and Yuna this audio drama introduced is pretty cool, as small of a consolation as that is. Which leads to what I think is the biggest major issue the Final Fantasy X EU brings to the table. All of the post-Final Fantasy X-2 content seems to be unable to move on from, the same 3 things that were present in the first game. It feels like they're absolutely terrified to do anything different, and just spin their wheels on the exact same plot elements. Sin was a strong plot element in 10, and instead of trying to move the story in a new direction or finding something that tops it, instead, they just go, let's do that again. But it doesn't mean as much the second, the third, the fourth time, and even if they do find a good way of explaining it, as a player, you can't help but feel like you've been there, done that. For all of the negative criticism directed towards the new stuff the compilation of Final Fantasy VII introduced, and yeah, I involuntarily twitch in my chair whenever I hear the words Deep Ground 2, at least they were willing to take the characters and world in a new direction, instead of just retreading the same ground over and over. Except where Advent Children was like, Sephiroth again? Hell yeah, Sephiroth again. But you get my point. When I was a kid, I had a hard time accepting that stories end. I'd always want to know what happens next to these characters I'd spent dozens of hours getting to know. But then, as I grew older, I came to the conclusion most people do, is that a story is good because it ends. A conclusion is what makes it so important. A conclusion is what makes it leave so much of an impact. Thoughtlessly dragging a plot along, whether for financial convenience or by a legitimate desire to shove in more, only hurts the story in the long run. Final Fantasy X had an arguably perfect conclusion, and while I don't like how Tidus' revival happened in X-2, I think it's at least fine and makes for an overall good story. If they had stopped there, I would have absolutely no qualms about how this duology of games turned out. But they didn't stop there, and now, if they ever do make a Final Fantasy X-3, it's going to have to follow the conclusions the novel and audio drama set up. It's going to be about Yuna traveling to defeat Sin, only this time there are a few OCs shoved in, and she has a fresh breakup with Tidus. But maybe they'll never make X-3, and maybe the final legacy of the X series will be this awkward cliffhanger from side content you really wish you could close your eyes and pretend doesn't exist. And you know what? I changed my mind. Go ahead. Make Final Fantasy X-3, you cowards. Do it. I'm full willing to see just where this train goes. I don't have any confidence they can turn these events into a decent plot, but I'll stick around just so I can know what happens. And now that we're winding down on that, I want to cap off this video by going over the ending plot events from Final Fantasy X-2. Obviously, there's going to be some spoilers about what happens, so if you don't want to hear about those, make sure to skip to the timestamp I'm going to put on screen now. I mean, this is a 20-year-old game you can get for like a tenner on most Steam sales, so I'd be surprised if anyone's still avoiding spoilers on it. So the Tidus-like figure Yuna has been seeing in the spheres is named Shuyin, and like Tidus, he was a resident of Zanarkand from 1,000 years ago. He had a lover named Len, who was a summoner drafted to fight on the front lines of the Bavel-Zanarkand War. To try and save her, Shuyin captures Bavel's secret weapon of mass destruction, Vegnagun, but Len followed him, and the pair were captured and killed. Right before the pair died, Len told Shuyin she loved him, but he never heard her, and Shuyin became a spirit bent on taking revenge on Spira for everything the war took from him. In present day, he swaps between possessing the leaders of each of Spira's major factions. First is Nuge of the Youth League, and second is Barlai of New Yevon. Those two, along with Pain and Gipple, were part of the Crimson Squad, a team in the Crusaders, the group that fought Sin in the first game. Nuge shot them all after being possessed by Shuyin, but they survived and went their separate ways. This is Pain's backstory, by the way, in case you were still wondering about that. The problem our main characters face is that Vegnagun has disappeared from its holding chamber underneath Bavel, which could mean bad news for all of Spira if the wrong person were to get a hold of it. And unfortunately, the wrong person does get a hold of it, since Shuyin manages to take control of Barlai and dashes off with Vegnagun. This causes monsters to start pouring out of the temples spread across Spira, and it's up to the Gullwings to go stop them. Let me tell you, it is extremely cathartic to go through these areas and not have to do the Cloister of Trials puzzles. At the end of each of these dungeons, you fight a Dark Aeon and also find a hole where the Faith used to be. Figuring out these holes are connected to Vegnagun, the Sphere Hunters devise a plan to hop in and try and find it. It's not exactly the most dire pre-final mission cutscene in the world, but I love Brother's dumb antics in this scene where they finalize their plan. I also like how Shinra hugs Yuna before she sets off. Despite his whole genius shtick, he is just a kid at the end of the day. Jumping down the hole, the party finds himself in the game's most optimal farming spot, where you can gain like 20 levels in an hour. Just letting you know, because X-2 has a pretty big difficulty spike at the end here. I was feeling pretty comfortable clearing the content up to this point at a level in the high 30s, but if you roll up to Vegnagun like that, you're gonna get smoked in an instant. Anyways, as you keep going down into the dungeon, you fight more Dark Aeons, and it's cool to see the Magus Sisters and Anima get their time in the spotlight. After finishing the music puzzle where you have to trial and error platform a bunch of piano pillars while remembering a melody, something that was apparently so traumatizing I completely forgot to get footage of it, you get to the final sequence. This is it. Everyone you met on your journey is coming together to take on Vegnagun. Nuge says he's gonna sacrifice himself to give them a chance to take it out, but Yuna refuses, saying that this time, no one dies. After defeating Vegnagun, Shuyin stumbles out and mistakes Yuna for Len, given that they look kinda similar, I guess? Yuna tries to placate him to talk him out of fighting, and it's a weirdly emotional scene. She's telling him what she thinks Len would want him to hear, but like I said before, it's also become her moment of closure. Confronted face to face with Shuyin, she has to come to terms with the fact that, no, he isn't Tidus. The hope she was chasing across Spira, the small glimmer that maybe Tidus was still out there somewhere, turned out to be a wish that just didn't pan out. When she tells Shuyin as Len that she has words unsaid that she needs to get off her chest, she's also saying the words she wished she could have told Tidus before he disappeared. Shuyin eventually sees through the disguise, which kicks off the final boss battle. You've probably been wondering this since the beginning of the video, but as for why Shuyin looks like Tidus, your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. No, he's not directly related to Tidus or anything, but there is one conversation in the game that states the resemblance is, quote, not a coincidence. The most supported theory is the memory of Shuyin was a base the Faith used to create Tidus, but that's neither here nor there. To me, he resembles Tidus in the same way Yuna resembles Len. I mention this now because Shuyin fights like Tidus. The attacks he uses are Tidus' attacks. I mean, the real explanation for this is they just reuse the Tidus model in its animations, but it's kinda weird how it hints at a deeper connection that doesn't seem to exist. After the battle is won, the real Len appears from Yuna's dress sphere. She asks Shuyin to finally come with her to the other side, and despite his fears, he agrees. Again, you can see the parallels of this in Yuna. She's scared to admit that Tidus is gone, but she has to face her fears and come to terms with the fact that she won't be seeing him again. That is, unless you fulfilled certain requirements. Then the Faith will ask you if you want to see the person you care for again. After the battle is over, Gipple, Nuge, and Baralai give a speech to declare an end to the fighting, and ask all groups to come together for the future of Spira. Yuna is shown on the hood of the Gullwings airship, looking, slightly off-model, if I'm being honest. She tells Brother to go faster while monologuing about her future, and then the game ends. If you answered yes to the Faith's question earlier, you get an extra scene where Tidus washes up on Besaid. He embraces Yuna, and she asks him if he's real, to which he replies, "What do you think?" Everyone watches on from the shore, and it's nice to see these characters reach a happy ending. I want to be clear, I'm not mad at the way this game concludes, I just take issue with how little build-up there was to this moment. How it seems to go against the themes the game was trying to present. If you 100% the game, you get an extra scene where Tidus says he's a memory of the Faith, and when Yuna asks if he'll disappear again, he promises to stay with her for as long as he's able. And I mean, you know the events of the side content, so much for that. Anyways, that about wraps up the game, so let's hit the conclusion and get out of here. So, that's Final Fantasy X-2. There's a lot to say, and a lot of it is hard to say. Some parts of this game are great, and it makes me glad they took their chance on making a sequel. Other parts make me wonder if it was worth it, like this whole thing opened up a can of worms in the Final Fantasy X continuity that you can't just go back and close. The entire Final Fantasy X extended universe just seems at odds with itself. It can't decide on what it wants to do or be. Events happen that 180 the entire main plot points of the previous entries, and it's hard to follow with a straight face. If they ever do make a 10-3, they're really gonna have to double down on writing to bring it up to a quality that would wrap this whole thing up nicely. I personally have no idea where they could take it to achieve that goal, but I'm also not a head writer at Square Enix, so, you know, not my job. I think one thing I can say about 10-2 that's pretty uncontroversial is that the game is fun. It's just fun to pick up, play, and get deep into the battle system. The focus on side content is unique, and while I think they went way overboard, it's definitely a one-of-a-kind feeling Final Fantasy game. And even though they would get undermined later, a lot of plot points and themes in this game, especially the ones about letting go and moving on, do hit. There are some genuine emotional moments mixed in. So, is 10-2 a good game I'd recommend you play? I guess it all depends on perspective. Is a sequel to a mainline Final Fantasy also a mainline Final Fantasy? There's likely no hard rule on this, but it's some food for thought. If 10-2 is considered a mainline Final Fantasy, the issue arises, where do you draw the line? Is 12 Revenant Wings a mainline Final Fantasy? Is Type 0 a mainline Final Fantasy? Is For the After Years a mainline Final Fantasy? I certainly hope it isn't. I can't give you a definite answer to this question, it's something for you to think about. So if you do plan to play all the mainline Final Fantasy games, I guess I'd suggest adding 10-2 to the list. Anyways, I'll say this, I definitely think you should give 10 a try, and since it's unironically difficult to purchase the game in 2023 without having a copy of 10-2 included, you're most likely going to own it whether you like it or not. Drop a comment if you know the single way you're able to purchase 10 HD separately. I'll wait. Since you're likely going to own a copy of 10-2 anyways, I'd say you should give it a go. At worst, it'll be a short 15 to 20 hour RPG with some banging gameplay, so you don't have all that much to lose. Just don't try to 100% it. You have my permission and blessing to bare minimum this one. Anyways, that's all I got for today. Stay tuned for the next video, whenever that is. As always, a big thanks to everyone for watching. Till next time.